It's not every day that humanity invites one of the most feared apex predators in the galaxy over for dinner. If you'd told me a week ago that I'd be serving ribs to a pack of Ravagers, yes, the Ravagers, the apex hunters of the Zarquin Nebula, I would have laughed in your face. But here I was, standing in front of a sizzling grill on the observation deck of the Galactic Concord's flagship, holding a pair of tongs and hoping I didn't start an intergalactic war with too much barbecue sauce. What started as a joke, an offhand invitation during a heated diplomatic debate, had turned into the strangest night of my life. A night that somehow changed humanity's place in the galaxy forever. In the grand halls of the Galactic Concord Summit, a human shouldn't stand out. Not when you're surrounded by beings with shimmering scales, glowing eyes, or appendages that defy physics. But somehow I, Captain Jack Rogers of the Starward Hope, had managed to do just that. "Captain Rogers," Ambassador Ferax hissed in my ear, his antennae twitching. "I need to remind you that this is a formal diplomatic summit. Please refrain from any unnecessary theatrics." "Theatrics," I whispered back, feigning innocence. "I'm just here to listen." Ferax shot me a look that suggested he didn't believe a word of it. To be fair, neither did I. Humans had a reputation for being unconventional at these events, and I wasn't about to let our reputation down. The summit was a spectacle of galactic diplomacy. Delegates from every corner of known space had gathered to debate, argue, and occasionally agree on matters ranging from trade routes to territorial disputes. But this year's agenda had one topic overshadowing everything else: the Ravagers. The Ravagers were the kind of species that haunted bedtime stories. They were hunters, true apex predators from the Zarquin Nebula, towering beasts with razor-sharp claws, golden eyes that seemed to pierce through your soul, and a predatory intelligence that made them more dangerous than any fleet of warships. For centuries, they'd been a menace to the outer systems, preying on whatever they deemed worthy of the hunt: creatures, resources, and occasionally entire colonies. The Galactic Concord had spent decades avoiding open conflict with them, but their growing incursions had made that impossible. This summit was a last-ditch effort to negotiate peace, though everyone knew the odds of success were slim. The Ravagers didn't negotiate. They hunted, and now one of them stood in the middle of the Concord's grand chamber, radiating menace like a star radiates heat. Gorthak, the Ravager representative, was everything you'd expect from his species: massive, imposing, and utterly unbothered by the uneasy murmurs of the assembled delegates. He stood at least 9 feet tall, his obsidian black fur gleaming under the chamber's lights. His claws, each one as long as my forearm, clicked softly against the floor as he paced. But it was his eyes that held the room. Golden, unblinking, and cold, they seemed to see through every soul present. "Representatives of the Galactic Concord," he growled, his voice a low rumble that echoed off the chamber walls. "You have summoned us here to discuss peace." The way he said the word made it clear how little he thought of the concept. Peace is irrelevant to us. The hunt is our way, our purpose. You cannot change the nature of predators. The chamber fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone present. It was a powerful speech, one designed to intimidate, and judging by the faces of the other delegates, it was working, well, on most of them. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the arrogance of a species that had clawed its way up the food chain against all odds. Maybe it was the coffee I'd chugged that morning. Or maybe it was just the sheer absurdity of the moment. Whatever the reason, I raised my hand. The chamber turned to look at me, a collective wave of disbelief sweeping through the crowd. Ferax, standing beside me, looked like he was about to have a stroke. "Captain Rogers," Gorthak said, his golden eyes narrowing as they fixed on me. "Speak." I stood, trying to look as nonchalant as possible under the weight of his gaze. "Gorthak," I said, keeping my tone casual, "you ever tried barbecue?" The silence that followed was deafening. Every species in the room turned to stare at me, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright horror. Ferax actually face-palmed. Gorthak tilted his massive head, his eyes narrowing further. "Barbecue?" he repeated, his tone flat. Yeah, I said, leaning against the railing of my seat. Slow-cooked meat, marinated in spices, grilled to perfection. It's a human tradition. You might like it. The room erupted in murmurs, disbelief rippling through the gathered delegates. Some of the more delicate species looked like they might faint at the idea of humans grilling meat as part of a tradition. Others, like the reptilian Zarnathians, looked intrigued. Gorthak, however, didn't look amused. "You mock us," he growled, his claws flexing. "Not at all," I said quickly. "I'm serious. Humans may not be apex predators, but we know a thing or two about cooking. I'm just saying, if you're so confident in your superiority, why not try something new?" Farax grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong for someone with such spindly limbs. "Captain, are you trying to start a war?" he hissed. "Relax," I whispered back. "I've got this." "You do not got this," Farax shot back, his antennae twitching furiously. "That's a Ravager, not a dinner guest." But Gorthak wasn't dismissing the idea. If anything, he seemed intrigued, though he hid it well behind a mask of disdain. "You are bold, human," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But your traditions are irrelevant to us." "Maybe," I replied, shrugging. "But why not find out? You're here for diplomacy, right? Consider it an exchange of cultures. You share your hunting stories, we share our recipes." The murmurs in the room grew louder. I could feel Farax's frustration radiating off him, but I pressed on. What did we have to lose? The Concord's attempts at negotiation were going nowhere. If the Ravagers respected strength, maybe they'd respect the audacity of a species that had turned cooking into an art form. Gorthak stared at me for a long moment, the silence stretching until it became almost unbearable. Then, to everyone's shock, he let out a low, rumbling laugh. "Very well, Captain Rogers," he said. "We will accept your invitation, but be warned, Ravagers do not eat prey that is unworthy." "Good," I replied, grinning. "Neither do we." The moment the session ended, Farax cornered me in the hall. His antennae were twitching so violently that I half expected them to fall off. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he demanded. "You've turned a delicate diplomatic situation into a dinner party. And it's the most progress we've made all week," I pointed out. "Come on, Farax. You've seen how they operate. They're not going to respond to treaties and speeches. But if we show them who we are, what we're capable of, they might just listen." Farax let out a long, exasperated sigh. "This is insanity. You do realize that if they don't like the food, they might decide to eat us instead. That's why we're going to give them the best damn barbecue they've ever had," I said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Trust me, Farax. This is going to work." Over the next 2 days, the Starward Hope was transformed into a culinary battlefield. The observation deck, with its panoramic view of the stars, became the venue for the dinner. We set up grills, tables, and enough food to feed an army. Every crew member pitched in, gathering recipes from Earth's diverse cultures to create a menu that showcased the best humanity had to offer. Bob, my chief engineer, took charge of the grill. "I can't believe we're doing this," he muttered, flipping a rack of ribs. "We're feeding apex predators. You know that, right? Apex predators. Which is why we need to impress them," I said, basting another rack with sauce. "If we can't win them over with diplomacy, we'll win them over with flavor." "You're insane," Bob said, shaking his head. "But I'll admit, this smells amazing." As the sun set over the observation deck, the Ravagers arrived. They moved as a pack, their massive forms casting long shadows across the deck. Gorthak led the way, his golden eyes scanning the setup with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "This is your offering?" he asked, his voice low. "Not just an offering," I said, handing him a plate. "It's an experience. There's something surreal about preparing dinner for creatures that could at any moment decide you're the main course. Every time I looked at the sizzling grills or the carefully laid out banquet table, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the most reckless thing I'd ever done, and that's saying a lot for someone who once flew a shuttle through an asteroid field to escape a Zarnathian blockade. Bob, my chief engineer and the resident skeptic of the Starward Hope, summed it up best. "You do realize this might be the dumbest idea in the history of humanity, right?" he said, gesturing at the rack of ribs he was marinating. "We're throwing a dinner party for apex predators. What's next? Tea with a black hole?" "It's not about the food," I replied, brushing barbecue sauce onto another rack. "It's about showing them who we are." "And who are we, exactly?" Bob asked, raising an eyebrow. "Adaptable, resilient, and apparently crazy enough to invite Ravagers to dinner," I said with a grin. Planning a meal for a species that hunts for sport wasn't as simple as throwing steaks on a grill. For one thing, the Ravagers didn't eat just anything. Their biology required an extremely high protein intake, and they were known to reject anything they considered unworthy prey. That meant the menu had to be perfect, not just delicious but challenging. "We're not just feeding them," Amelia, our science officer, explained as she calibrated a molecular scanner to analyze the meat. "We're trying to impress them. Ravagers respect strength and effort. If they think we've taken shortcuts, they'll see it as an insult." "Great," Bob muttered. "So now I'm not just a cook, I'm a gladiator. No pressure." The crew pulled together recipes from every corner of Earth, combining flavors and techniques to create a feast that would do humanity proud. There were slow-smoked ribs from the American South, fiery curries from India, fermented shark from Iceland, and a massive centerpiece, a whole roast beast, imported from one of the outer colonies and seasoned with a blend of spices so potent that even the Ravagers would take notice. "This might be the most ambitious meal in Galactic history," I said as I surveyed the spread. "Or the last meal of the Starward Hope," Bob replied. "I'm betting 50 credits they hate the fermented shark." The Ravagers arrived just as the twin suns of the conquered system dipped below the horizon, casting the observation deck in a warm, golden glow. Their silhouettes were massive against the backdrop of the stars, their movements fluid and deliberate. Every step they took seemed to vibrate through the deck, a reminder of their raw power. Gorthak led the way, his golden eyes scanning the setup with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Behind him, 4 other Ravagers moved in formation, their claws clicking softly against the deck plates. The sight of them was enough to make even the bravest crew members shift uncomfortably. "This is your offering," Gorthak rumbled, gesturing at the tables laden with food. "It's more than an offering," I said, stepping forward. "It's a challenge. We want to show you what humans are capable of." He tilted his head, the golden light catching on his obsidian black fur. "A challenge?" I gestured toward the table. "You judge prey by its strength, don't you? By its ability to evade, resist, or survive? Consider this an extension of that. Every dish here represents the effort, ingenuity, and adaptability of humanity. If it's unworthy, you'll know. If it's not..." I let the sentence hang in the air. Gorthak stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a low growl, he stepped forward and picked up a plate. The atmosphere on the deck was electric as the Ravagers inspected the food. The crew watched nervously from the sidelines, their conversations reduced to hushed whispers. Even Bob, who usually had a sarcastic comment for every situation, seemed tense. Gorthak's first choice was a rack of ribs, glistening with barbecue sauce. He held the bone up to his face, sniffing it cautiously before taking a deliberate bite. The room seemed to hold its breath. His reaction was immediate. His eyes widened, and a low rumbling sound emanated from his chest, a sound I later realized was the Ravager equivalent of a satisfied hum. He devoured the rib in 2 more bites, then reached for another. "This is acceptable," he said, his tone grudging but sincere. The other Ravagers followed his lead, selecting dishes with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Their reactions varied. Some growled appreciatively as they tasted the roasted beast, while others cocked their heads in confusion at the fermented shark. One brave Ravager sampled the fiery curry, only to let out a startled roar and down an entire pitcher of water. "Not bad for prey," one of them muttered, earning a round of approving growls from the others. As the meal continued, the tension on the deck began to ease. The Ravagers, who had entered the dinner with the air of predators assessing their prey, began to relax. They shared hunting stories, their guttural voices carrying tales of battles against beasts larger than starships. In return, we shared our own stories, not of hunting, but of survival. Humans are strange, Gorthak said as he reached for another plate of ribs. You do not hunt for sport, you hunt for survival, yet you create such ritual around it. It's not just about survival, I explained. It's about connection. Food brings people together, whether it's a family, a community, or, I gestured around the deck, an unlikely group of dinner guests. Gorthak let out a low chuckle. Unlikely indeed. The conversation took a surprising turn when one of the younger Ravagers asked about the origins of the fermented shark. Bob, who had been dreading this moment, reluctantly stepped forward to explain. It's a dish from Earth, he said, holding up a piece of the pungent fish. It's made by burying shark meat in the ground and letting it ferment for months. It smells terrible, tastes worse, and is strong enough to knock out most species. But for humans, it's a delicacy. The Ravagers exchanged skeptical glances. Finally, one of them, a lean female with piercing yellow eyes, stepped forward and picked up a piece. She sniffed it, wrinkled her nose, and then popped it into her mouth. For a moment, her expression was unreadable. Then she let out a sharp bark of laughter. This is disgusting, she said. But it is strong. I respect it. Her reaction seemed to break whatever lingering tension remained. The Ravagers began sampling the more challenging dishes with renewed enthusiasm, their growls of approval mixing with the crew's laughter. By the time the meal ended, the observation deck was unrecognizable. Plates were piled high with bones, the air was thick with the scent of smoke and spices, and the once imposing Ravagers were sprawled comfortably in their chairs, their golden eyes glinting with satisfaction. As the last of the dishes were cleared away, Gorthak stood, his massive form casting a long shadow over the deck. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. You are strange creatures, he said finally. You do not hunt with claws or fangs. You do not dominate your prey through strength alone. But you have shown that even the weakest can be formidable when united. Perhaps there is value in this. I smiled, raising a glass in his direction. Two unlikely alliances. Gorthak let out a low chuckle, his golden eyes gleaming. Two alliances. It's one thing to plan a dinner party. It's another thing entirely to host one for apex predators who could, with minimal effort, flip the table and decide you're the meal. I kept that thought in the back of my mind as the Ravagers settled into their seats on the observation deck of the Starward Hope. Gorthak, their leader, sat at the center of the table, his massive form dominating the space. Around him, the rest of his delegation waited in silence, their golden eyes flicking between the dishes laid out before them. From a distance, the Ravagers exuded calm control, but up close, the tension was palpable. Every move they made felt deliberate, their bodies coiled with restrained power. They were studying us, evaluating the meal as much as the species that had prepared it. Relax, I whispered to Bob as he placed another plate of smoked ribs on the table. This is going fine. Fine? Bob muttered, glaring at me. They're staring at the food like it insulted their ancestors. This is the opposite of fine. Trust me, I said with a grin. They're going to love it. The Ravagers' hesitation wasn't surprising. Their culture revered strength and domination. Accepting food from another species, one they saw as weaker, wasn't just unusual. It was borderline insulting. I knew it would take more than presentation to win them over. This meal had to prove something. Gorthak was the first to break the silence. He reached for a rack of ribs, his massive clawed hand dwarfing the plate. For a moment, he simply held the rib, studying it like a predator sizing up its prey. Then, with a deliberate motion, he brought it to his mouth and bit down. The room seemed to hold its breath. Gorthak chewed slowly, his golden eyes narrowing as he processed the taste. For a split second, I thought we'd failed, that the Ravagers would declare the meal unworthy and storm off. But then, something incredible happened. He rumbled, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the room. It wasn't a growl of anger or disgust. It was approval. This, he said, his voice carrying the weight of his authority, is acceptable. The tension broke like a dam. The other Ravagers, emboldened by their leader's verdict, began reaching for the food. At first, they chose cautiously, grilled meats, roasted vegetables, and other straightforward dishes. But as they tasted more, their confidence grew. One of them, a lean female with sharp yellow eyes, tried the fiery curry. She let out a startled roar as the heat hit her tongue, reaching for a nearby pitcher of water. The crew froze, unsure whether to laugh or flee, until she barked out a guttural laugh and reached for another bite. As the dinner progressed, the line between predator and prey began to blur. The Ravagers, who had arrived as imposing hunters, began to relax. Their growls turned to deep chuckles as they shared hunting stories, describing battles with beasts that would make a Terran lion look like a house cat. "We hunted the Zarquin Leviathan for 7 days," one of them boasted, tearing into a piece of roasted beast. Its hide was thicker than a starship's hull, and its teeth could shatter moons. Bob, who had finally started to relax, chimed in. "Sounds like my last repair job on the warp core." The Ravager tilted his head, clearly unsure whether Bob was joking. Then he barked out a laugh. "Humans are strange," he said, his voice tinged with amusement. "You do not hunt like us, but you survive all the same. It is intriguing." "You could say the same about your species," I replied, raising a glass. "We may not have claws or fangs, but we've got fire and ingenuity." Gorthak, who had been silent for most of the meal, looked up from his plate. "And yet, you do not hunt for sport. Why?" It was a simple question, but it carried weight. In Ravager culture, hunting wasn't just survival. It was identity. To hunt was to prove strength, to assert dominance. The idea that humans didn't share that instinct was almost incomprehensible. I thought for a moment before answering. Because for us, the hunt isn't the goal. Survival is. And survival means finding strength in each other, not just in ourselves. Gorthak's golden eyes studied me, his expression unreadable. "Strange creatures," he murmured, "yet not without merit." Everything was going surprisingly well, until the fermented shark made its appearance. The dish, a delicacy from Earth's northern regions, had been included as a bold move. Fermented shark wasn't for the faint of heart. Its smell alone was enough to make most species reconsider their life choices. And the taste? Well, let's just say it was an acquired one. When the dish was unveiled, the Ravagers froze. Even Gorthak, who had devoured the ribs with enthusiasm, hesitated as the pungent aroma wafted across the table. "What is this?" one of them growled, wrinkling his nose. "It's called hakarl," I explained, doing my best to keep a straight face. "It's a traditional dish from Earth, shark meat fermented to perfection." "Fermented?" Gorthak repeated, his tone skeptical. "Yep," Bob said, stepping forward with a piece on a fork. "It's strong, it's weird, and it's one of the toughest things we eat. Think you can handle it?" The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet. For a moment, I thought the Ravagers would reject it outright. But then the lean female, the one who'd tackled the curry earlier, reached out and took a piece. She sniffed it cautiously, her sharp yellow eyes narrowing. With a deliberate motion, she popped it into her mouth. The room went silent. She chewed slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to disgust, to something resembling grudging respect. Finally, she swallowed, letting out a sharp bark of laughter. "This is revolting," she declared. "But it is strong. I respect it." The rest of the Ravagers, emboldened by her reaction, began sampling the shark. Their responses varied. Some growled in approval, while others gagged and downed their drinks to wash away the taste. But none of them rejected it outright. For the first time, the crew and the Ravagers laughed together, the sound echoing across the observation deck. It was a small moment, but it felt like a breakthrough. As the meal wound down, the atmosphere on the deck had completely transformed. The Ravagers, who had arrived as intimidating hunters, were now swapping stories and jokes with the crew. The tension that had hung over the summit for days was gone, replaced by something resembling camaraderie. Gorthak stood, his golden eyes sweeping across the room. "Humans," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "You are unexpected. You do not dominate with strength, yet you command respect. You do not hunt for sport, yet you survive. There is more to you than I imagined." "Thanks," I said, raising my glass. "And for the record, you're not so bad yourselves." He let out a low chuckle, his claws flexing as he picked up one last rib. "Perhaps there is value in this alliance. Perhaps, I replied, smiling. But next time, you bring dessert. The dinner was over, but its impact was just beginning to unfold. As the Ravagers departed the observation deck, the lingering aroma of smoke and spices was quickly replaced by a hum of subdued energy. The crew of the Starward Hope moved quietly, clearing the tables and grills with the efficiency of a team that knew the stakes were still high. Bob approached me, wiping his hands on his grease-stained apron. "So we survived," he said, glancing toward the now empty deck. "No claws, no bloodshed, and they didn't toss us into the void. I'm calling that a win." "It's more than that," I replied, watching the distant figures of the Ravagers as they retreated toward their quarters. "We didn't just survive, Bob. I think we made an impression." He raised an eyebrow. "You really think a plate of ribs and some fermented shark is enough to change a species like that?" "It's not just the food," I said, shaking my head. "It's what it represents. We showed them a side of humanity they didn't expect. One that isn't about fighting or dominance, but connection." Bob snorted. "Connection through barbecue. Now there's a tagline for the history books." The next day, the Galactic Concord Summit reconvened, but the atmosphere was markedly different. Word of the dinner had spread, and the delegates were abuzz with speculation. Some dismissed it as a trivial distraction, while others hailed it as a bold diplomatic move. As for the Ravagers, they arrived with an air of measured calm that hadn't been there before. Gorthak, towering as always, took his place in the center of the chamber. His golden eyes scanned the room, but this time they didn't radiate disdain. If anything, there was a flicker of something else, curiosity perhaps, or respect. "The humans," he began, his voice a low rumble that silenced the murmurs, "have demonstrated that strength is not the only path to survival. Their traditions, strange as they are, show a resilience and creativity that cannot be ignored." I couldn't help but smile as the other delegates exchanged surprised glances. Coming from a Ravager, this was high praise indeed. Gorthak turned to me, his gaze steady. "Captain Rogers, you spoke of unity, of survival through connection. Perhaps there is merit in this, but words are not enough. Prove it." The room fell silent, all eyes on me. I stood, choosing my words carefully. "Unity isn't something you prove in a single day," I said, my voice firm. "It's something you build, piece by piece, over time. Last night was just the beginning. If we work together, Ravagers, humans, and everyone else in this room, I think we can build something that lasts." Gorthak regarded me for a long moment before nodding. "We shall see." Gorthak's words weren't a dismissal, they were a challenge. Over the next few days, the Ravagers observed the crew of the Starward Hope closely, testing us in ways that ranged from subtle to overt. They joined our drills, studied our technology, and even participated in simulated survival scenarios. At first, their presence was unsettling. The Ravagers moved with a predatory grace that made it impossible to forget their strength. But as the days passed, something shifted. They stopped viewing us as prey and began seeing us as something else, partners. One moment in particular stood out. During a simulated hull breach, a younger Ravager named Thork attempted to bypass a containment field using brute force. When that failed, Bob stepped in, showing him how to reroute the power supply instead. Thork growled in frustration but followed Bob's instructions, his claws deftly manipulating the controls. When the field stabilized, he turned to Bob and let out a low, approving rumble. "You are resourceful," he said, his golden eyes gleaming. "Not strong, but clever." Bob grinned. "I'll take that as a compliment." The real breakthrough came during a joint exercise in the nearby asteroid belt. The Ravagers had proposed a hunt, a simulation designed to test both species' abilities in a high-stakes environment. The goal was to track and neutralize a rogue automated drone that had been reprogrammed to evade detection. The hunt began with the Ravagers taking the lead, their instincts and agility allowing them to navigate the asteroid field with ease. But as the drone adapted, it became clear that brute force wouldn't be enough to capture it. That's when the humans stepped in. Using our ship's sensors and a bit of creative problem solving, We devised a trap that forced the drone into a dead-end corridor within the field. When the Ravagers moved in for the final strike, their admiration was evident. "You see the prey's path before it is taken," Gorthak said as the drone was neutralized. "This is unexpected." "It's what we do," I replied with a grin. "Sometimes survival isn't about strength. It's about outthinking the problem." By the end of the exercise, the tension between our species had all but vanished. The Ravagers, once dismissive of humans, now spoke of us with something approaching respect. They still viewed themselves as superior. Old habits die hard, but they no longer saw us as weak. "We are different," Gorthak said during a quiet moment on the observation deck. "But there is strength in difference. Perhaps there is value in alliance." "There is," I replied. "We've seen what happens when species like ours fight. Imagine what we could accomplish if we worked together instead." He regarded me with those piercing golden eyes, then nodded. "You speak truth, Captain Rogers. Let us see if your actions match your words." Back at the summit, the tone of the discussions shifted dramatically. Where once there had been hostility and distrust, there was now a sense of cautious optimism. The Ravagers, inspired by their interactions with humanity, began to entertain the possibility of cooperation, not just with us, but with the Galactic Concord as a whole. It wasn't an easy process. Decades of animosity couldn't be erased overnight, and there were still plenty of delegates who doubted the Ravagers' intentions. But the seeds of change had been planted, and for the first time, there was hope that something stronger could grow. For humanity, the experience was a revelation. We'd always seen ourselves as survivors, but this was something more. We'd shown that even the most fearsome predators could be reached, not through force, but through connection, through understanding. As the summit drew to a close, Gorthak approached me one last time. "You have earned our respect, Captain Rogers," he said, "but respect is only the beginning. If this alliance is to mean anything, you must prove it in the hunt." I frowned. "The hunt?" He grinned, his sharp teeth glinting in the light. "There is a beast on Zarquin Prime, one that has evaded even our best hunters. If you truly wish to stand among us, bring your crew, join us in the hunt." It was an invitation and a challenge, one that would test everything we'd built so far, and I wasn't about to back down. When Gorthak extended his challenge, I didn't hesitate. I might have been out of my mind, but saying no to the Ravagers after everything we'd built together wasn't an option. A hunt on Zarquin Prime wasn't just a test. It was the ultimate opportunity to solidify an alliance with one of the galaxy's most feared species. And let's be honest, it sounded like one hell of an adventure. The crew of the Starward Hope wasn't so eager. "You said yes?" Bob asked, his voice rising an octave as he stared at me. "You agreed to hunt what?" "A beast," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "One that even the Ravagers haven't been able to catch." Bob buried his face in his hands. "Of course, because agreeing to grill ribs for apex predators wasn't suicidal enough. Now we're going to their home planet to track a monster." "Relax," I said, clapping him on the shoulder. "We've survived worse." Bob peeked at me through his fingers. "Have we? Because I'm pretty sure this is uncharted territory." "Exactly," I said with a grin. "And uncharted territory is where we thrive." Zarquin Prime was unlike any world I'd ever seen. From orbit, it shimmered with a vibrant emerald hue, its thick jungles stretching endlessly across its surface. But as we descended into the atmosphere, the true nature of the planet revealed itself. The jungles were alive. Towering trees swayed despite the lack of wind, their bark shimmering with bioluminescent patterns. Vines moved of their own accord, snaking through the underbrush like sentient creatures. And the sounds, low, guttural growls, sharp screeches, and unidentifiable clicks, created a constant symphony of danger. "This place doesn't just have predators," Bob muttered as we touched down in a clearing. "It is a predator." The Ravagers were already waiting for us. Gorthak and his pack stood at the edge of the clearing, their golden eyes scanning the jungle with practiced precision. Even here, on their home turf, they were on high alert. "Welcome to Zarquin Prime," Gorthak said, his voice a low rumble. "The hunt begins at dawn. Rest while you can." Over a crackling campfire, Gorthak described our target. The creature, known as the Vorthos, was a legendary beast that had eluded the Ravagers for centuries. It was said to be as large as a starship, with scales impervious to most weapons, and a cunning intelligence that rivaled even the most advanced AI. It hunted not for food, but for sport, just like the Ravagers themselves. "It is the ultimate prey," Gorthak said, his golden eyes gleaming. "To best it is to prove oneself worthy of the hunt." "Has anyone ever seen it?" I asked. "Many have tried," Gorthak replied. "Few have lived to tell the tale." Bob groaned softly. "Great, a ghost monster. That'll end well." I ignored him, focusing on the map Gorthak had laid out. The Vorthos was known to stalk a region called the Shadow Vale, a dense jungle filled with bioluminescent flora and labyrinthine terrain. If we were going to catch this thing, we'd need a plan. At dawn, we set out. The Ravagers moved with practiced ease, their massive forms cutting through the jungle like shadows. My crew, on the other hand, struggled to keep up. The jungle seemed to resist us at every turn, its shifting vines and uneven terrain making every step a challenge. Mischief, the smallest of the Ravager pack, stayed close to me. Over the past few weeks, we developed a strange bond, and I found its presence oddly comforting. Its mismatched eyes seemed to glint with anticipation as it sniffed the air, its sleek form poised for action. The first sign of the Vorthos came at midday. A low guttural growl echoed through the jungle, sending a chill down my spine. The Ravagers froze, their golden eyes narrowing as they scanned the trees. "It is close," Gorthak murmured. We moved cautiously, following the sound until we reached a clearing. At the center of the clearing was a carcass, massive, reptilian, and half-eaten. The air was thick with the scent of blood and decay. "It's marking its territory," Gorthak said, his voice low. "It knows we're here." The attack came without warning. One moment, the clearing was silent. The next, the jungle erupted in chaos. The Vorthos burst from the underbrush, a blur of motion and teeth. It was larger than I'd imagined, easily 30 feet long, with scales that shimmered like molten metal. Its eyes burned with a predatory intelligence, and its roar was deafening. The Ravagers moved instinctively, their claws and teeth flashing as they engaged the beast. But the Vorthos was fast, too fast. It darted between them, striking with a precision that was almost surgical. I shouted orders to my crew, directing them to set up a perimeter while Bob activated a drone to track the Vorthos's movements. But even with our technology, it was clear we were outmatched. The beast wasn't just strong, it was smart. It anticipated our moves, using the jungle to its advantage. "This isn't working," Bob yelled, ducking as the Vorthos's tail smashed into a nearby tree. "We need a new plan." It was Mischief who turned the tide. The small Ravager darted toward the Vorthos, its mismatched eyes glowing with determination. At first, I thought it was suicidal. There was no way it could match the beast's size or strength. But then I saw what it was doing. Mischief wasn't attacking. It was distracting. The little Ravager danced around the Vorthos, nipping at its legs and dodging its strikes with uncanny precision. Its movements created an opening, and Gorthak seized the opportunity. With a roar, he leapt onto the Vorthos's back, driving his claws into the beast's scales. "Now, human," Gorthak bellowed. "Your fire!" I didn't hesitate. Using the modified plasma rifle we'd brought for emergencies, I fired a concentrated burst at the Vorthos's exposed underbelly. The shot hit its mark, and the beast let out a deafening roar before collapsing to the ground. The jungle was silent once more as we stood over the fallen Vorthos. Gorthak's pack let out triumphant roars, their voices echoing through the trees. But Gorthak himself was quiet. He knelt beside the beast, his golden eyes studying it with a mixture of respect and sadness. "It was a worthy hunt," he said finally. "And you, humans, have proven yourselves." The words carried more weight than I could have imagined. In Ravager culture, respect wasn't given lightly. It was earned through action, through strength and ingenuity. And in that moment, I knew we had earned it. When we returned to the summit, the mood was electric. The Ravagers, once aloof and intimidating, now spoke of humanity with admiration. They shared stories of the hunt, praising our resourcefulness and bravery. Gorthak stood before the assembled delegates, his massive form radiating authority. "The humans are not prey," he declared. "They are allies, and together we will shape the future of this galaxy." It wasn't just a victory for humanity, it was a turning point for the entire galactic concord. For the first time, there was hope that unity was possible, even among the most unlikely of allies. Looking back, the hunt on Zarquin Prime wasn't just about catching a beast. It was about proving that humanity had a place among the stars, not as conquerors or victims, but as partners. We showed the Ravagers that strength isn't just about claws and teeth. It's about adaptability, ingenuity, and the courage to face the unknown. And as I stand here now, watching mischief curl up at my feet, I can't help but think, if we can win over the galaxy's most fearsome predators, there's nothing we can't do. The hunt, after all, is only just beginning.